When the car pulled up in front of my house, I did something I shouldn't have. I should have reached for the door handle, mumbled a polite thank you, and gotten out, like I did every other night. But I didn't. Before we get into the details, let me know in the comments where you're watching this video from. Instead, I sat there, fingers curled loosely in my lap, heart beating just a little too fast. "You okay?" Mike asked. His voice had shifted, the casual air replaced with something softer, something closer. I nodded, forcing myself to move, to break the spell of the past 20 minutes. My fingers brushed the handle, just brushed it, before I hesitated. "It was nice talking to you," I said. His gaze met mine in the rear-view mirror. "You too." And then, right as I started to pull away, he said it. "You're running from something. You know that, right?" The words hit like a pulse of electricity through my spine. I stared at him, mouth slightly open, mind scrambling for something, anything, to say. But nothing came. Because he was right. I was running. From what? I wasn't sure. My life? My marriage? Myself? I swallowed hard, forcing a small smile, trying to act like that hadn't just unraveled me from the inside out. "Good night, Mike." He nodded. "Good night, Sarah." I stepped out into the cool night air, the city buzzing around me, but it felt like the world had shifted. I wasn't the same woman who had climbed into that car 20 minutes ago. And I didn't know what that meant yet. The first mistake was looking for him again. The second was finding him. It was 2 nights later when I saw his car again. I had meant to. I wasn't the kind of person who searched for trouble, who invited danger into her life. But I was also lying to myself. Because the moment I spotted that familiar black sedan parked near my office, something inside me twisted. I could have walked away. I should have walked away. Instead, I lingered. And then, as if fate had been waiting for me to make my choice, his window rolled down. "Need a ride?" Mike's voice was edged with something unreadable, something knowing. I hesitated. Not because I didn't want to get in, but because I did. Too much. Still, my feet moved before my mind could catch up, and the door clicked shut behind me. His eyes met mine in the mirror. "Rough day." "You could say that." He pulled away from the curb, and just like before, silence filled the space between us. But this time, it wasn't empty. It was charged. I felt it in the way his fingers gripped the wheel, the way his eyes flicked up to meet mine more than they should, the way my breath felt shallow and unsteady in my own chest. This wasn't just a ride home anymore. It was something else. Something I wasn't ready to name. I told myself the third time would be the last. The fourth was when I stopped believing that lie. It became a pattern, one I refused to acknowledge for what it really was. A text when I worked late. "Need a ride?" A glance at my phone. A beat of hesitation. Then my fingers typing back. "Yeah." I stopped telling my husband, Ben, when I was coming home. Stopped checking the time as often. Mike never pushed. Never asked for more than I was willing to give. But that was the problem. Because with him, I wanted to give more. And one night I did. It wasn't planned. That was what I told myself later. It wasn't something I had thought about, at least not in a way I was willing to admit. But the moment I slid into his car that night, something felt different. The air was heavier. The silence wasn't just silence anymore. It was something waiting to break. Neither of us spoke for a while. The city rolled past us in streaks of gold and red, the world moving on like it always did, unaware of the storm brewing inside that car. I should have asked him to take me home. I should have told him that this needed to stop before it went too far. Instead, I did the one thing I swore I wouldn't do. I reached across the center console and placed my hand over his. His fingers tightened instinctively, his breath hitching just slightly, so slightly I might have imagined it. But I hadn't. His knuckles flexed beneath my palm, and for a long moment, neither of us moved. Then, slowly, he turned his hand over, pressing his palm against mine. A choice. A line crossed. I didn't pull away. And neither did he. I don't know how long we sat there, hands intertwined over the leather console, the weight of what we had just done pressing down on both of us. All I knew was that I didn't want to let go. And I didn't. Not when he pulled the car into a quiet street, away from the glow of the city. Not when he turned to face me, his eyes dark and unreadable. Not when his fingers brushed against my jaw, his touch hesitant, like he was giving me one last chance to stop this. But I didn't stop it. I leaned in. And then, everything I had been holding back, the quiet yearning, the late-night glances, the stolen moments in the rearview mirror, exploded between us. His lips met mine, and in that instant, the world outside disappeared. No job. No marriage.
No consequences.
Just him. Just us. And when we finally pulled away, breathless, shaken, changed, he whispered the words that would haunt me for a long, long time. You knew this was going to happen, didn't you? And the worst part? He was right. I had known. From the moment I got into that car. The problem with crossing a line is that once you do, there's no going back. And I didn't want to go back. Not to the late nights spent waiting for a husband who barely noticed me anymore. Not to the silence that filled my home, colder than any winter night. Not to the version of myself who had spent years pretending she wasn't drowning. But guilt has a way of creeping in when you least expect it. When I got home that night, Ben was still awake, sitting at the kitchen table, waiting. I froze in the doorway, my heartbeat slamming against my ribs, my lips still tingling for Mike's kiss. Ben looked up. His eyes met mine. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something worse than guilt. I felt seen. And I realized in that moment that maybe I hadn't been the only one keeping secrets. Maybe my husband had a few of his own. The door shut behind me, sealing us in. The air inside the car felt different this time, thicker, charged with something we both understood but hadn't put into words yet. Mike didn't say anything right away. He just looked at me, his fingers tapping against the steering wheel, his jaw tight like he was trying to decide whether to speak or let the silence do the talking. I beat him to it. I shouldn't be here. The words came out flat, emotionless, like they weren't even mine. Mike's lips twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. But you are. He wasn't wrong. I exhaled sharply, my hands balling into fists in my lap. This is a bad idea. You keep saying that, he said, his voice calm, steady, like he wasn't sitting inches away from a woman who had kissed him in the dark and gone home to another man. But here we are again. I looked at him then, really looked at him. The way his knuckles flexed against the wheel. The way his eyes held mine like he already knew how this was going to end. Maybe he did. Maybe I did, too. The part of me that should have gotten out of that car, the part that still belonged to Ben, felt distant, like a memory I couldn't quite reach. What was one more mistake? Drive, I whispered. And he did. We didn't go far. A few turns, a few streets away from the places where either of us had to be accountable. A quiet parking lot behind a closed cafe, the neon, open sign flickering weakly like it had been forgotten. Neither of us moved. The engine hummed beneath us, the heat of the night pressing in, thick and heavy. Mike turned the key, and the car went silent. His hands dropped to his lap. I didn't know who moved first. Maybe it was him. Maybe it was me. Maybe we had both been moving toward this moment from the second I got into his car that first night. His hand brushed against mine, just barely, just enough for me to feel the calloused edges of his fingers, the warmth of his skin against mine. I should have pulled away. I didn't. My breath hitched, and before I could think better of it, my fingers curled around his. Mike inhaled sharply, his jaw tightening as he turned toward me. Sarah. It was barely a whisper. My name, nothing more. But the way he said it, like it was something that mattered, something that carried weight, was what undid me. And suddenly, my lips were on his. It wasn't careful. It wasn't slow. It wasn't the kind of kiss you steal when you're testing the waters. It was the kind that burned. The kind that demanded something, took something, unraveled something deep inside you that you'd been pretending wasn't there. Mike didn't hesitate. His hands slid into my hair, his fingers tightening as he pulled me closer, like he had been waiting for this just as long as I had. And maybe he had. Maybe this was always going to happen. Maybe it was inevitable. I didn't think about Ben. I didn't think about what this meant. I didn't think at all. Because for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt alive. The moment shattered too quickly. 1 second, I was lost in the heat of Mike's mouth, in the way his hands curled into my hair like he wasn't planning on letting go, like he didn't care what happened after this. The next, reality slammed back into me with the force of a car crash. I pulled away first. I had to. My breath was uneven, my hands still gripping the front of his shirt like I wasn't ready to let him go just yet. But I had to. My heart was a riot in my chest, my body still burning, still wanting, still so goddamn starved for something I hadn't even realized I was missing. Mike was watching me, his breathing just as unsteady, his lips still slightly parted like he wasn't sure if I was about to kiss him again or run. I didn't know either. My voice cracked. He exhaled sharply, running a hand over his jaw before resting it on the wheel. You don't have to say anything. But I did. Because the longer I sat here, the longer I let the weight of what we had just done settle between us, the more I realized. I wanted to do it again. And that was a problem. Because mistakes were supposed to make you feel regret. Not this. Never this. I swallowed hard, reaching for the door handle. Mike didn't stop me. But he also didn't say goodbye. And for some reason, that felt worse. When I got home, Ben was already asleep. Or, at least, he pretended to be. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom for a long moment, watching the slow, steady rise and fall of his breathing, my fingers still tingling from Mike's touch. I should have felt guilty. I should have climbed into bed and stayed awake all night, hating myself for what I had just done. But all I felt was hollow. Ben and I had been living in separate worlds for so long that the thought of hurting him didn't feel real. Maybe because he didn't seem capable of being hurt by me anymore. Maybe because he had already stopped caring. Or maybe because he was hiding something too. The signs had been there for months. The late nights at the office that didn't add up. The way he always angled his phone away when he texted. The way his eyes never lingered on me anymore, like I was just another part of the house instead of someone he once wanted. I wasn't stupid. I wasn't blind. But I had been pretending not to see it. Because if I saw it, if I really let myself admit what was happening, then I wasn't just the one betraying him. We were both guilty. And maybe we had been for a long, long time. 2 days passed. I told myself I wouldn't see Mike again. That I would let that moment in the car stay exactly where it was, buried, untouched, something I could lock away before it destroyed everything. But then I got the text. Mike said, I don't know if you're trying to forget. But I'm not.
A choice.
One I had already made the second I kissed him back. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for all of 2 seconds before I typed out my reply. Where are you? The address Mike sent wasn't a place I recognized. It wasn't a bar. Not a coffee shop. Not another quiet parking lot where we could pretend the world didn't exist for a little while.
It was a motel.
A cheap, out-of-the-way kind of place where people went when they didn't want to be seen. I should have turned around the second I pulled into the lot. But I didn't. Because the truth was, I had made my decision long before I got into my car. Maybe long before that first kiss. Maybe the moment I met him. Mike was waiting outside when I parked. His hands were in his pockets, his expression unreadable, but his eyes told me everything I already knew. I stepped out of the car.
We didn't speak.
We didn't have to. He reached for me first. His fingers curled around my wrist, pulling me toward him, his body heat already pressing against mine before we even made it inside. And when the door shut behind us, the last piece of my old life walked out with it. I don't remember how long I stayed. Time didn't exist in that room. Only Mike's hands, his mouth, the weight of him against me. The way I melted under his touch like I had been waiting for this for years. Because maybe I had. It wasn't just the physical part of it. It was what came after. The way we lay in the dark, tangled together. The sound of our breathing, the only thing filling the silence. The way he traced absent-minded circles along my skin, like he wanted to memorize me. Like he wasn't ready to let go. Neither was I. I went home smelling like him. Like his skin. His cologne. His sin. Ben was in the kitchen when I walked in, sitting at the table, his laptop open in front of him. He barely looked up. Hey, he said, his voice distracted, his eyes still on the screen. That was it. No questions.
No suspicion.
Not even a glance to see what time it was. Because he didn't care. Or maybe because he was too busy keeping secrets of his own. I should have felt guilty. That was the rule, wasn't it? You do something like this, something reckless, something that could blow up your entire life, and you're supposed to feel sick afterward. You're supposed to drown in regret, struggle to meet your husband's eyes, carry the weight of your betrayal like an anchor around your neck. But as I stood there in our kitchen, watching Ben scroll through his laptop like I wasn't even there, all I felt was anger. Because if he had looked up, if he had searched my face for answers, even for a second, maybe I would have broken. Maybe I would have confessed right then and there. Maybe I would have told him that I had been in another man's bed. That I had let Mike touch me in ways he hadn't in years. That I had already crossed the line so many times, I didn't even know where it was anymore. But he didn't. He just kept typing. Kept existing in the same detached, indifferent way he had been for months, maybe even years. And suddenly I knew. I knew without a doubt. He was hiding something, too. The thought consumed me. I barely slept that night, lying awake next to Ben, listening to his slow, steady breathing while my mind unraveled everything I had ignored for so long. The late nights at the office. The way he always put his phone face down. The way he never touched me anymore. Maybe it wasn't me he had stopped wanting. Maybe it was just that he had already found someone else. The next morning, I watched him carefully. The way he moved through our routine, casual, unbothered, like nothing in our world had shifted. Maybe for him, it hadn't. Maybe this had been broken for a long time, and I had just been too blind to see it. Or maybe he was just better at lying than I was. I poured coffee into a mug, keeping my voice even. What time will you be home tonight? Ben barely glanced up. Late. Big meeting. A flicker of something burned in my chest. How late? He hesitated for only a fraction of a second. Just long enough for me to see it. I don't know. I'll text you. And that was it. That was the confirmation. I didn't need to check his phone. I didn't need to follow him. I didn't need a confession. I already knew. Ben was cheating on me. Just like I was cheating on him. I should have felt relief. Because now, at least, I didn't have to carry the guilt alone. But I didn't feel relief. I felt like something inside me was cracking open, like I had been walking on a thin sheet of ice and had just realized how deep the water was underneath. I could confront him. I could scream at him, demand the truth, demand to know how long it had been going on. But I didn't. Because what was the point? We were already past that. We had both betrayed each other. And now the only thing left to do was decide what kind of ending we wanted. Mike texted me that afternoon, "Are you okay?" It was the first time he had asked. The first time he had acknowledged that this thing between us wasn't just physical. That there was something else tangled up in it, something deeper, something dangerous. I stared at the screen for a long moment before typing back.
No.
A pause. Then Mike asked, "Do you want to talk?" And just like that, I was already making my next mistake. I met him at a bar. Not the quiet, dimly lit kind that invited secrecy. This was louder, packed, full of life. I didn't know why I had chosen it. Maybe because I needed the noise, the distraction, the proof that I wasn't about to do something I could never take back. But the moment I saw Mike standing near the back, waiting for me, I knew it was already too late. His eyes flicked over me, slow, careful. Like he was searching for something in my expression. Like he already knew something was wrong. I slid into the seat across from him, my hands wrapping around the cold glass the bartender had just set down. He didn't ask questions right away. He just watched me, patient, waiting. "You ever just know something?" I said finally, my voice quieter than I meant for it to be. Mike tilted his head slightly. "What do you mean?" I exhaled, staring at the amber liquid in my glass. "I think Ben is cheating on me." The words sounded foreign coming out of my mouth, like they belonged to someone else's life. Someone else's mistake. Mike didn't react the way I expected him to. He didn't look surprised. He didn't even look angry on my behalf. He just studied me for a long moment, then asked, "And what do you want to do about it?" I let out a short laugh, shaking my head. "I don't know." But that wasn't true. Because the answer was already sitting in front of me, waiting. I didn't go home that night. I didn't even think about it. I let Mike take me back to that motel, to the room that smelled like him, to the sheets that weren't mine, to the space that had somehow become more familiar than my own bed. I didn't ask for explanations. I didn't care about the consequences. I let him strip me down, let him pull me under, let him erase the reality I wasn't ready to face. Because for the first time since this all started, I wanted to drown. And I didn't want to come up for air. I woke up to the sound of rain. Soft at first, a quiet patter against the motel window, like the world was trying to be gentle with me. But then, the storm picked up. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Raindrops slammed harder against the glass, matching the steady, heavy pulse in my chest. I turned my head, finding Mike still asleep beside me, his arm draped loosely over my waist. His breathing was even deep. Like this was normal. Like this was something we could keep doing. Like there wasn't an entire life waiting for me on the other side of that door. I stared at him for a long moment, my fingers curling into the sheets. I had done it again. I had chosen him again. And the worst part? I didn't regret it. Not even a little. By the time I got home, the storm outside had turned into a full downpour. Water pooled in the streets, cars sent waves splashing onto sidewalks, and lightning cracked the sky in quick, blinding flashes. I barely noticed. My hands were still gripping the steering wheel too tightly, my heart still unsteady in my chest, my mind still replaying the way Mike's lips had felt against my skin, the way he had whispered my name like it belonged to him. But when I stepped inside our house, everything shifted, because Ben was waiting for me, sitting at the kitchen table, just like before. Only this time, he wasn't looking at his laptop. He was looking at me. And I knew. I knew before he even opened his mouth. He knew. The silence between us was suffocating. Ben's fingers drummed once against the table before he leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. You want to tell me where you were? My throat tightened. I could lie. I could say I was at work. I could say I went out with friends. I could say anything except the truth. But what was the point? He already knew. I could see it in his face. I don't think you want the answer to that, I said quietly. Ben let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. Wow. I swallowed, bracing myself for the explosion, for the shouting, for the accusations. But it didn't come. Instead, he just sat there, staring at me like he was trying to figure out what part of me had disappeared. Like he was wondering when, exactly, he had lost me. Maybe the same moment I had lost him. How long? He asked, his voice quieter now. I hesitated. A while. Ben nodded, like that made sense. Like he had already suspected as much. Like maybe he had been waiting for me to admit it. And then, after a long pause, he said the one thing I wasn't ready for. I've been seeing someone too. The world blurred. The storm outside, the hum of the refrigerator, the way the air suddenly felt too thick to breathe. None of it mattered anymore. Because nothing hit harder than those words. I had known. I had suspected for months. But hearing him say it? Hearing him admit it like it was nothing, like we were just exchanging facts instead of setting fire to our marriage? That was different. That was real. I let out a shaky breath, gripping the back of a chair to steady myself. Who? Ben sighed, running a hand through his hair. Does it matter? Maybe not. But I needed to know anyway. Someone from work, he finally said. It just happened. I let out a sharp, bitter laugh. Yeah, I know how that goes. Ben's jaw tightened. Guess that makes us even, huh? The words sliced through me. Even. Like this had been some kind of race. Like the fact that we had both betrayed each other somehow made it okay. Like it erased everything. But it didn't. It just meant that we had both been lying for a long, long time. The fight should have come next. That's what couples do when they find out about affairs, right? They scream. They throw things. They say things they can't take back. But instead, we just sat there, across from each other, in the ruins of something we had both set on fire. Finally, Ben sighed. So what now? I stared at him, my chest tightening. I should have had an answer. But I didn't. Because for the first time I realized I wasn't sure if I wanted to fix this. Ben's question hung between us, heavy and unmoving. So what now? I should have had an answer. But all I could think about was how tired I was. Tired of pretending. Tired of waiting for something to fix itself. Tired of holding on to a marriage that had already slipped through my fingers. I searched his face for something: anger, sadness, regret.
But all I saw was exhaustion.
Because maybe he was tired too. Maybe we had both been holding on to something that wasn't there anymore. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Do you even want to fix this? Ben looked at me for a long time. Then, finally, he shook his head. I don't know. Neither did I. We didn't decide that night. There was no dramatic ending, no packed bags, no doors slamming. Just the quiet acceptance that whatever we had been pretending to be, whatever this was, it wasn't working anymore. A week passed. Then, 2. We moved around each other like strangers, careful, distant, waiting for one of us to be brave enough to say the words out loud. But I already knew where I stood. I had known since the first night I got into Mike's car. I had known long before that. Ben and I had broken long before either of us cheated. We just hadn't been ready to admit it. The night I finally told him I was leaving, he didn't look surprised. He just nodded. I guess this was always where it was going, huh? I swallowed, my hands tightening at my sides. Yeah. A long silence stretched between us. Then, softer. Do you love him? I flinched. Not because I hadn't thought about it, but because I had. And I didn't know the answer. Did I love Mike? Or did I just love what he had given me? Attention, warmth, the feeling of being wanted again? I shook my head. I don't know. Ben nodded like that made sense.
Yeah.
Me neither. And that was it.
No screaming. No begging.
Just 2 people finally accepting what they had been running from for a long, long time. I didn't go to Mike that night. I didn't text him. Didn't call. I just drove. Through the city. Past the places I used to go. Past the memories that were already starting to feel like they belonged to someone else. For the first time in years, I was completely, terrifyingly alone. But maybe that was a good thing. Because before I could figure out where I was going next, I needed to figure out who I was without Ben. Without Mike. Without the version of myself that had been breaking for years. So, maybe this isn't the ending you expected. Maybe you thought I'd run straight into Mike's arms, that we'd drive off into some kind of messy, passionate future together. Or maybe you thought Ben and I would fight for this, that we'd try to rebuild the wreckage, piece by broken piece. But sometimes, the real ending is realizing that it's okay to walk away. So now I'll ask you, if you were me, if you had the chance to start over, would you? Or would you stay and try to fix what's already broken? Share your thoughts in the comments. Let's discuss. If this story resonated with you, support the channel, like, subscribe, and click the bell to not miss new releases. Let's talk together about things that really matter.